Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going on a journey through a period in Indian history that's absolutely fascinating, the events leading up to the 1857 uprising. We've got some really interesting sources to help us along the way. And believe me, by the time we're done, you'll have a whole new perspective on this major turning point. So,
Yeah. It's amazing to think that this wasn't just a simple clash between two cultures. We're talking about 18th century India.
right.
It was this complex mix of different kingdoms, each one with its own ambitions and rivalries. And right in the middle of it all was the British East India Company. And they were really smart about using those rivalries to their advantage to gain power, you
One,
know?
like a giant game of chess.
Ugh.
But with entire kingdoms as the pieces. What really struck me in the sources was this idea that some Indian princes, they were so focused on their own goals that they actually asked the company for help to fight their rival.
Yeah, it's a classic example of what happens when you don't think about the long-term consequences. They basically handed the company the keys to the kingdom little by little without even realizing it. And it really shows how internal conflicts can be used by outsiders who are just waiting for the right opportunity.
But it wasn't a complete takeover.
Hmm.
The sources also talk about figures like Tipu Sultan of Mysore. He really fought back against the company's advances. He saw what was happening when others didn't.
Right. Tipu Sultan's resistance is really important because it reminds us that there wasn't just one single way that Indians responded to the British. Some saw the company as a way to get ahead, maybe even as an ally, while others, like Tipu Sultan, recognized the danger they posed in the long run. It makes you wonder how the average person living through this time saw these massive changes happening all around them.
It must have been a really turbulent time. I mean, from what I've read, the company's rise over the next few decades really changed the whole fabric of Indian society, and not always in good ways.
Exactly. They had a two-pronged approach, you could say. The first was military conquest, to expand their territory. And the second was economic manipulation. They basically drained India's resources by imposing heavy taxes that forced farmers off their land, and then they flooded the market with British-made goods, which really hurt local industries.
Reading about the famines that happened during this time is just heartbreaking. The sources don't hold back in showing how British policies directly contributed to so much suffering.
And, it wasn't just the economy that was affected. The British introduced English education, which, it had some positive effects, but ultimately it was about creating a class of Indians who would serve their administration. It's a complicated legacy because while it did expose people to new ideas, it also contributed to this sense of cultural displacement and even worsened divisions within Indian society.
It's like feeling like a stranger in your own home, isn't it? The sources really capture that feeling. And there's this constant undercurrent of British disdain towards Indians, this idea that they were somehow inferior. It's a reminder that colonialism was about more than just physical control. It was about controlling how people thought, too.
Absolutely. And it's during this time of social and economic upheaval that we see people like Ram Mohan Roy emerge. He's a really fascinating figure, a product of this turbulent era, but also a visionary who challenged both the British and the problems within Indian society itself.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. I mean, while many people were just struggling to survive, Ram Mohan Roy saw that India needed to reform itself. He advocated for reason and scientific knowledge. He even argued that all religions at their core have a universal truth. Just like cow's milk is always white, no matter what color the cow is.
And he didn't just talk about these ideas. He founded newspapers to criticize British policies, and he even traveled all the way to England to fight for the rights of Indians. That was a really bold move, especially for that time.
It's amazing how he used the tools of the colonizers, like the printing press, to challenge their authority. It really makes you think about how his ideas are still relevant today, how they connect to the conversations we're having now about social reform and cultural identity. It's like history is repeating itself in a way.
It definitely is. And even though he pushed for modernization, he never forgot his Indian heritage. For him, progress wasn't about rejecting the past. It was about building on it to create a better future.
And that struggle between holding on to tradition and embracing new ideas must have resonated with so many Indians during this period. It really sets the stage for the growing tensions and the unrest that would eventually lead to the 1857 rebellion.
Yeah, by the middle of the 19th century India, it was like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. You had the economic exploitation, the loss of land and traditional ways of life, the constant pressure of British customs and laws. It all added up to this huge amount of resentment towards British rule.
Yeah, like they say, it's the last straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one thing. It was everything all together. The weight of it all pushing people to their breaking point. That sources really capture that sense of simmering anger
Yeah,
and frustration.
exactly. And remember, We're not talking about one single group of people. You had peasants who lost their farms, landlords stripped of their power, former rulers longing for their lost kingdoms, and religious leaders worried about their traditions disappearing. All these different groups, each with their own complaints, but they all started to come together united by this feeling of resistance.
And you mentioned earlier how the British introduced English education. It's kind of ironic how that actually played a role in this growing discontent, right? They wanted to create a class loyal to them, but instead they exposed this new generation of Indians to ideas like democracy, liberty, and self-determination.
It's really a testament to how powerful ideas can be, isn't it? The very tools they used to strengthen their control ended up planting the seeds for their downfall. These educated Indians, they could see the hypocrisy. They saw the difference between the ideals of British Enlightenment and the harsh reality of their rule.
The sources mentioned the Santhal Rebellion in 1855, when indigenous tribes rose up against unfair land policies. It feels like a warning sign, a preview of what was to come just a couple of years later.
Absolutely. The Santhal Rebellion may have been crushed, but it was a clear sign of the growing unrest. It showed that resistance wasn't just an idea, it was a real threat.
And then in 1857, we have that spark that ignites the whole thing, the greased cartridges. For those who might not know, what was it about these cartridges that caused such an uproar?
Well, the cartridges were for the new Enfield rifles, and the rumor was that they were greased with animal fat from cows and pigs, specifically. Now, this was a massive problem for both Hindu and Muslim sepoys who made up a big part of the company's army. For Hindus, the cow is sacred, and for Muslims, the pig is considered unclean.
It's hard to believe that something that seems so small could cause such a huge rebellion. It really shows how sensitive religious and cultural issues can be, especially in a diverse society like India.
It's a classic example of cultural insensitivity, and it had huge consequences. What the British saw as a minor logistical issue was actually a deep violation of core beliefs for many of their soldiers.
And then we have the story of Mangal Pandey, the sepoy, who refused to use the cartridges and ended up attacking his British officers. He became a symbol of defiance that really resonated with people.
Mangal Pandey's bravery was tragic. He was executed, but his actions had a ripple effect. His resistance became a focal point for the resentment that was already brewing, and it quickly spread beyond the military.
The rebellion exploded from Meerut to Delhi. It engulfed northern India. It wasn't just sepoys, it was peasants, landlords, former rulers, religious leaders. People from all walks of life rose up. It's amazing how quickly it spread and how diverse the people involved were.
It's important to remember that this wasn't some carefully planned uprising. It was a spontaneous outburst fueled by shared grievances and a desperate desire to break free from British rule. And while there were key figures like Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, and Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the exiled Maratha Peshwa, each with their own reasons for joining, it was ultimately a mass movement driven by the people themselves.
So you have this massive outpouring of anger and resentment. How did the British, with all their power, react to this sudden and widespread rebellion?
At first, they were taken by surprise, but they quickly responded with brutal force. The rebellion was met with violent reprisals. There's a lot of bloodshed on both sides.
It must have been a terrifying time for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And what happened in 1857 marks a real turning point in the history of British rule in India. Even though the rebellion was eventually put down, it shattered the idea that British rule was unbreakable, and it exposed the weaknesses of the colonial system.
And this is where our deep dive takes a really interesting turn. Even though the rebellion failed to achieve its immediate goals, its impact on Indian history is undeniable. So we've talked about everything leading up to the rebellion and the rebellion itself. And now the aftermath. It seems like the legacy of the 1857 rebellion is more than just a simple defeat.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's a complicated legacy. There are the immediate consequences, of course. The brutal crackdown, the loss of life, and the end of the East India Company's rule, which meant India came under the direct control of the British Crown.
So it's almost like the rebellion, even though it failed, actually made British control stronger. That seems kind of strange.
Yeah, in the short term it did. But here's where things get interesting. This whole event, this brutal suppression, it actually became the starting point for something much bigger, the Indian independence movement. You see, 1857 planted the seeds of nationalism. It made people realize that even though India was so diverse, they were united in their struggle against British rule.
So even in losing, they gained something. It sparked a movement for change. That's a powerful idea.
Exactly. It forced the British to look at their colonial system and see the problems it had. And even though the reforms they made afterwards were slow and often reluctant, they did show that they knew things needed to change. But even more important than that, 1857 showed that the British weren't unbeatable, and that realization gave hope to future generations of freedom fighters. It inspired them to keep fighting for their independence.
One thing that stood out to me in the sources was how differently the rebellion is viewed depending on who's talking about it.
Yeah.
In British accounts, it's often called a mutiny, just a local uprising of some unhappy soldiers. But in India, it's celebrated as the first war of independence, a heroic fight against oppression.
That difference in perspective is really important. The way we talk about history shapes how we understand it, and it influences our views in the present. The fact that 1857 is remembered so differently in Britain and India shows just how deep the impact of colonialism runs. And it highlights the ongoing struggle to reclaim those historical narratives.
Yeah, it reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts. It's a living story that's constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped.
Exactly. And whenever we look at any historical period, it's so important to think about those different perspectives, to be critical of what we're reading. Who's telling the story? What's their point of view? What might they be leaving out?
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the events leading up to and after the 1857 rebellion, what can we take away from it for today? I mean, we're still dealing with the effects of colonialism, and the fight for social justice and self-determination is still happening all over the world.
I think 1857 teaches us a timeless lesson about the power of resistance. It shows how important it is to understand different viewpoints and to constantly question the stories that shape our worldviews. History isn't fixed. It's an ongoing conversation between the past, present, and future.
It's a reminder that even when things seem impossible, the human spirit's desire for freedom and dignity can never really be crushed. That quest for self-determination is something that connects people across time and cultures.
Absolutely. And even though 1857 might seem like ancient history, it still has a lot to say about the challenges we face today. The courage and resilience of those who fought for a better world even when the odds were stacked against them. It's an inspiration to us all.
This has been an amazing journey through a really crucial period in Indian history. I hope everyone listening has gained a deeper understanding of this complex era, the reasons behind it, the consequences, and the lasting impact it's had on the world we live in today.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end this deep dive. The story of 1857 isn't just about India's past. It's a story about humanity's never-ending search for freedom, justice, and a world where everyone has the right to decide their own fate. It's a story that's still being written in different ways, in different places, even as we speak.